If you want to make someone do something, you have to make them feel something. And how you make someone feel something is by telling them a story. Every single story is made up of 3 C's, and those 3 C's are context, conflict, and conclusion. All of our stories have to have all 3 of those things in order to be an effective story. The greatest storytellers are interested before they are interesting. The first step actually in growing in your storytelling is just becoming wildly interested in the stories of others.
Before we jump into this episode, I'd love to invite you to be a part of the community where you can listen to more content to help you be a smarter, stronger, and better equipped, successful leader. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button. I would love and appreciate your support. It's amazing to me to watch the community grow and read all of your comments each and every week. I can't wait to go on the journey with you. Thank you so much, and it means the world to me. On today's episode, I'm joined by Katie Quesada. Katie is an acclaimed speaker, consultant who is deeply passionate about the art of storytelling. Katie recently has worked with brands such as Nike, United Healthcare, American Eagle Outfitters, and many more to ignite their story for more effective communication, high trust within teams, and immediate ROI. She's married to a husband, Danny. They have 2 daughters. They live in Orange, California. She is also a recovering tiny home inhabitant.
I am.
And lastly, she is going to be one of our featured speakers at the Impact Summit this summer, July 29th and 30th in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We'll talk more about that. But Katie, 1, I'm excited to be here sitting with you. 2, I'm excited you're going to be at the summit this summer. Let's go.
Yes. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's so glad we got connected through all of the circles and spheres. And it's been so amazing to hear your story, Tyler, which is crazy. And I mean, I hope your audience knows it and gets to hear more of it. But I feel encouraged to be here as well.
So let's just start there. Why storytelling? Okay. Storytelling is an age-old practice, but yet we don't really understand the value of a good story. You think about maybe of like a book, a movie, whatever else, but not something interpersonal. So like, how does the whole idea of story like change life?
Yeah. It kind of hit me when I had been speaking at events for years. We had been bringing in speakers. And one night at one of these events, we brought in a woman named Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, who's amazing. You can follow her on the internets everywhere. She's rad. And she came and spoke and she stood on the stage and I was behind a little curtain in the background. And she said one Friday night, "Did you know that there is a Barnes and Noble of untold stories sitting in the room?" And I felt this like very significant conviction. You can call it, significant. God was like, Katie, or you can say I had a big feeling, whatever works for you. But for me, I felt like wildly convicted that I was never supposed to speak there again. And I was never supposed to bring in a speaker again. I was supposed to teach everyday people how to tell their stories. And that started my like storytelling journey where for the next 2 years, I behind the scenes would sit with a panel of people of very diverse background and ages. And they would tell me their life story, which usually took anywhere from 90 minutes to 3.5 hours, depending on who they are. And then I would help them say it in 6 minutes from the stage. And I did this over and over and over and over and over again. And it like was a totally secret passion of mine. And I was like, this is amazing. I love doing this. I love taking people's giant story and making it quick and concise and compelling. But I knew that my time at that job was coming to an end. And so I was like, I got to get out of here and quit this job. Things were going south. It was like, this is not the right fit for us. There's a lot of other wild stories as a part of this. Sold everything, moved into an RV, and I launched a story consulting business. And then I started working with individuals and then teams and then clients. And now I get to work with amazing major companies to help them tell more concise and compelling narratives. So yeah, it isn't that we need 3 really good storytellers. We need everyone to get better at storytelling.
Okay. So there's a piece of your story.
Mm-hmm.
You've given us context. I've done my research, right? There's context, but I'm just really, I'm deeply wondering, maybe this is personal. Hopefully you will go there.
Yeah. Of course.
Give me some more of the conflict. Why was it like that changed my life? Hearing Tamara talk about storytelling, oh my goodness, either something has happened to me where I need to help bring those Barnes and Noble stories out.
Yeah.
Because there's something stirring in me that I have to chase this.
Yeah. I've always been pretty curious, like naturally. And I think I've always heard people's stories and thought like, wow, that's crazy. But then I've heard them tell it and I thought, do they know? that that's crazy, because how they're telling the story is kind of like, oh yeah, I moved across the country and then I, rescued a dog and then that dog saved my life. And I'm like, that's a crazy
That's Homeward
story.
Bound, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm like, that's an amazing story. Do you know it? And I've always kind of had those feelings. So I think it kind of put something that I've always naturally been curious, and I naturally do desire to consolidate information just because my brain thinks highly quickly and I speak obviously very quickly as well. So the conflict was found really in my like job description versus what I was doing. So the conflict was the organization I was working at was not asking me to do this. This was like my side project to make me happy at my job. And then they were like, do your job. And I was like, you heard this lady's story, it's crazy, and they're like, okay. And it was kind of that process over and over again. So a lot of the conflict in the beginning was like, this was really, really risky. I mean, yeah, imagine telling your mom you're going to be a storytelling coach. She's like, oh, like, Katie, what? And now thankfully my mom and dad are both like, my daughter is a storytelling consultant for major brands. And she, so the 5-year transition happened. But in the beginning, it was really vulnerable. It's really vulnerable to make up a job. It's really vulnerable to have passion or idea. I mean, entrepreneurship, as you know, like deciding one day you're going to do something and then telling people you're going to do that is very vulnerable. And then to do that, and say it's something like storytelling coach, which someone's like, what's that? I'm like, I don't know either. Let's find out, and just kind of to slowly learn and grow. And thankfully it worked. But that the really big conflict is the initial vulnerability of saying you're going to do a thing, and then doing that thing. That's a really hard, I mean, a lot of us have been through that season. And I think that was the early on, really big initial conflict. And then I had a tiny baby at home and lived in a 180 square foot tiny house. So there was some other life things going on. But those are the biggies.
I want to stay there a little bit with like family. Like, what story are you going to tell your daughters?
Yeah.
They're 18, 19, 20, 21 in that range. I have a daughter 17 and she's looking at college or whatever else. And just hearing from that story, like, what story are you going to tell your daughters?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I know that yet. I think for them, my initial reaction to that is I think what they're going to care about is their part of the story.
Okay.
No matter what story you tell a kid, they're really wanting to be the hero of it, So I think that's my initial reaction is, I'll tell her my point of view, but all along what she's going to care about is her. She's like, what character am I playing in that thing? And that part of it, I get to say to her, when you were little, I wanted to live a different life. I wanted to live a life where I got to be with you, where I got to hang out with you, where I didn't feel stressed every single night, where I never worked till 5 or 6 again, like where I got to take these magical days where I worked when you were at school. I wanted to, that's why we sold everything and moved into the RV. We're like, how do we live a different life? And we did always want to live a different story, and she gets to be a part of that. And so I think that when I think about retelling that story to her, I'm sure it will look more like, here's the character you played and why it mattered.
So personal stories. We've talked about personal stories, right? And people can be listening. It's like, all right, Tyler, great. You and Katie can talk about personal stories. And there's a great intersection here. There's a great intersection because I believe we are in that crossroads, as you and I have discussed, is I believe the value of your work, why you go speak to organizations, is we have people and corporations. And those are meeting in the middle, kind of this stare down to say whose story is more important. And I feel like we're there. And I think that's like the value of what you have to bring to people. How have we gotten here, or how do you see us kind of walking hand in hand nicely, kumbaya down the road?
Yeah. We've gotten here because we pretended for a while that to-do lists and robots and job descriptions could inspire people. And we were like, no, just trust me, do it. And then people were like, no, like I am bored and I don't like this and your thing is boring. And there was a real conflict there where people were like, well, no, you should just want to do what I said because I'm your boss and I went to Harvard. And the younger people were like, uninterested. And there was this exchange where there's like authority that's lacking, compelling information that's lacking, human connection that's lacking. And in those moments, what we need is interpersonal human storytelling. So if you want to make someone do something, you have to make them feel something. And how you make someone feel something is by telling them a story. So What's wild is that this is universally an issue at all. I mean, I have led Storytelling 1.0 at brands like Nike or United Healthcare, and yesterday at SpaceX. Okay,
Ooh.
and I saw a rocket ship and like an
Ooh.
astronaut. Right, I'm not
Oh.
allowed to talk more about it because I signed a lot of NDAs. But like,
Elon will come after you.
yeah, I didn't
To
meet
be
him or
honest.
see him, but I did
Yeah,
see
no.
actual astronauts and like the Space Force, and they had like
Okay.
on army uniforms that said space. I was like,
Oh.
that is amazing. I was like, that guy is going to space. I didn't lead it for the astronauts, for the engineers. But in any environment that you're in, what I'm surprised by is that there has never been a company that this is not an issue, or an organization that this is not an issue, because we thought that interpersonal human storytelling wasn't high on the list of skills needed. And then we got to the place where we were like, oh, wait, that thing is what we need. Like the leaders that are emerging within organizations are ones that know how to communicate effectively in a way that's concise and compelling. They know how to talk about themselves, and they know how to make someone else feel like the hero. These are baseline things that people who rise up in an organization are doing, but we never taught the soft skills for it, right? So all those pieces to the puzzle are kind of here, and companies are coming to me and saying, we need a workshop on storytelling because our people are long-winded, they're boring, they're drowning in data, and they don't really know how to talk about their own thing, you know? And so those pieces of the puzzle are like, oh, great, good, good, good. The answer to all of these problems is really human storytelling, which it feels kind of like sometimes unnecessary, but then you see the fruits of it.
I think there was probably a large period of time where it's like, don't bring your story here.
Totally.
Like
Yes.
your story doesn't matter. No
Yes.
one cares about what you do outside of here. Come here, do the job. You alluded that earlier,
Yes.
but even in a leadership role
Yes.
or a founder, those things, and oftentimes the founder has this founder story,
Yes.
but then eventually it gets lost in saying, we're past that. Like that's
Yes.
immature. Don't bring your story here.
Yes.
Like, why do you think that happened?
Yeah. I think we started to consume information differently, which I think is probably the biggest factor, is that we started to care about people's everyday life because the stories we're watching every day are like, hey, this is what I had for lunch. Hey, this is this thing I had. Like we used to live in a world where you could live behind a curtain, right? You could go to work and then go home and they'd be like, oh, you have kids? I didn't know. And they just say things like that, at work. But now we open our phone and I get to see the behind the scenes of 10,000 people's life. So then we think, wait, I don't even know where my boss is from. So I don't trust him as much because I don't know anything about him. And all these kinds of internal dialogues begin to happen where we have a lack of trust because we have a lack of access. But then the boss is like, I don't want to tell you about my life. There's all these pieces to the puzzle there that are really tricky, but I really do think the hinge point is how we consume connected human storytelling. So we get to know so much about strangers, and then somehow we have to know nothing about the person we're with from 9 to 5 is a really interesting conundrum.
I mean, what strikes me is this idea that there's people that still believe my story's not important or your story's not important. And it's difficult because in many leadership positions, I believe that a great facet of leading, so part of the Awaken the Leader Within course that I have within Impact Driven Leader is, the lead segment is, your vision, your clarity of that vision, telling a story, but then using that to connect so you can influence with people. And, you mentioned this earlier that the greatest way to get someone to do something is by using a story. And it's just so, I agree with it, but it's difficult. I believe, when we understand the reasoning, then we can start to change the actions. And it's why do we have this idea and reason where everything needs to be so close to the chest? Do you think it's a lack of vulnerability that people are afraid if I tell them the truth, they're going to think less of me? If they know that I go home and, maybe I'm separated from my spouse and this or that, the other, that they're going to think less of me. I can't be this. Like, again, we could play out many stories, but is that maybe the root of it? This unwillingness to be vulnerable?
Yeah, I think that is a piece of it. I think there is like shame, fear, comparison. But I think the root probably is just, one of the things that I go over in the workshop that we'll talk about at your event too is that like the first thing to steal your story is going to be comparison. Like that's the first thing that's going to take it away is you thinking, well, I don't have like as cool of a story as Tyler. Like he's done way more than me. Like I don't need to share anything about my life. Like I haven't been through that craziest stuff. Like, and I'm not as successful. And so Tyler can do it. Let's just let him tell a story. Like I don't need to tell my story. Right? Comparison is going to steal your storytelling strategy. And when we can immediately realize, oh, the goal is not just Tyler's story. The goal is a diversification of storytelling, because what you, whoever is listening to this, what you have experienced that Tyler has not is needed by the world. Like that your unique perspective, advantage point, like me and you have only been through a set series of things, A to Z in our life, but someone else out there has been through things that we can't even fathom. And their survival guide of what they have overcome, the world needs, right? I mean, I think of it sometimes like Amazon reviews. Like imagine if there was just one perfect Amazon review for products. That's not helpful to us. I need 1,000, and I need 10 weird videos, and I need a girl in a similar size to me wearing it, right? I need a plethora of information on a review for this product. And I think that's actually how life is, right? Like I need 100 stories about marriage. I don't just need one to help my marriage, right? I need 100 stories on parenting, on motherhood, on being a working mom, on being a traveling working mom. I don't just need one person to tell me about it. I need courageous storytellers to come forward and not let comparison stop it.
So it is that the greatest? Because as you share that, I think about people around me that, think, oh, my story's not important. It's like, oh, I don't want to tell my story. Like, oh, my story doesn't matter. And I look at that too, the story I shared with you, my journey in life, and realizing that, no, that once I got to the place where I needed to tell it, not, and this is what I think is difficult is people almost feel like when I tell them when I'm telling my story, I'm going through therapy, I'm dumping, I'm the victim, I'm like blah, 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 vomiting all over you. And as opposed to it's like, no, I think sharing the story is to give you a perspective of who I am so we can build connection.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that's ground rules in the storytelling work that I do is that we speak from scars, not from wounds. So that's a
I
Nadia
love
Bolz-Weber
that.
quote.
Can you say that again?
Yeah,
Like
we need to speak from
somebody's
scars.
taking notes right now.
Yes, pen, paper, out. Quote by Nadia Bolz-Weber. But she says we need to speak from scars, not from wounds. So it is important to give a little bit of time for something to heal before it is shared. Will it be completely healed over? No, it might look like a big scar, but it isn't an open wound, right? And I meet with people and they're like, oh my gosh, Katie, I have this story. I got to tell you it. And they're sobbing uncontrollably. And I'm like, okay, you know what? We might need a little bit of time for this one, right? We might need a little bit of time. Or we have this environment where someone's coming and talking to me and I'm like, you know what? It sounds like lawyers are involved still, right? Like maybe let's wait on that. Like there are definitely stories that need to wait to be told and healing that has to take place in order for these stories to come to life. So I completely agree with what you're saying. Some of us are like, I don't want to dump on them. Like I don't want to. And I'm like, you're right. Go to therapy, talk to your close friends, and dump on your spouse and your best friend. Let it all out. After that, though, it's time to come up with a way to craft your story because your story does matter, and it needs to be heard. But you aren't dumping, you aren't oversharing. Like some healing has to take place, but it's really important that we think of our stories as valuable.
Well, I think what's interesting to me, and you mentioned just this idea of her telling our stories, what's important, what's not. I think we fall into the mindset or the pattern, my story doesn't matter, or my background, what got me to here doesn't matter. But I think it matters totally. And part of that for me is, growing up on a farm. And for many years growing up on a farm was like, dude, you're like, people listening in that grew up on farms too. We went through this, like we were kind of the bane of society. Like, oh, they're dumb people. Like there's a reason they live on farms because they're too poor to live anywhere else. I've heard those things. And the idea, but yet we're in a time and age where it's so far removed where people are like, how does that work? Like, tell me what that life's like. Like, what's it like? And so now I find myself in this place where, we have this conversation. We're talking about business, but yet there's this part of me that I still own cows. I still have, property with pastures and so forth and so on. And to be able to share that gives me context to where either relate or connect, but as well, yesterday I was talking to someone. And they were like, yeah, I've watched all your content. Actually, my podcast producer, he's like, I didn't know you grew up on a farm. And I think the relatability that allows for people, man, it takes your relationship and it goes from here to the next level. But that means we have to be open and vulnerable because they may reject us. Is that our issue why people don't share stories?
Yeah, I think your example is cool growing up on a farm because the story you were told is that's not cool, that wasn't smart, that's far away, distant from all that's happening.
Yeah, you can
Yet,
just go watch commercials today and they still say that about farmers. It's
right.
amazing how there's many people that want to tell the story of farming and they look at this dumb whatever and it's like, oh, it's pretty technologically advanced.
Right, but the pushback I want to give is I
Yeah.
think today some of the wealthiest people I know are trying to raise their kids on a farm. Like, so what's interesting is the full circle nature of our stories because what the world that we're living in now is like what I got to get my kids is space, land, and animals. Like,
Mm.
how do I get, and I have access to, I literally have friends who lived in homes in LA that are unbelievable and sold it all and live on a farm. And their kids wake up and they throw feed to chickens. And we visited them, and my kids threw the feed to the chickens, and then they're in muddy boots. And and they're like, this is the lifestyle we wanted. So I think that the narrative is so interesting because like something like farming in a lot of ways it's full circled. Like America's trying to homestead. People are like, wait, we got to get our kids off screens and out of these situations, like, and you're like, oh, hey, I did that. It was
Yeah.
called my childhood. Like
Yeah.
I was raised running around where I couldn't see an
Yeah.
adult. Like those
Yeah.
like I had autonomous independence, all these things that we're like naming now, like you want to have a kid in an area where they can run free and not see an adult. You're like, yeah, it's called living on a farm. Like these things that we're like trying to so I think there's something interesting too. And for a lot of us, we have a narrative about something in our life that is a story we've been told that someone else might have a totally different story about that thing. But you telling your story gets to get that connection point, right? So what I would respond to your story is not a point of judgment, like, oh, you grew up on a farm. I grew up in Orange County, California, like whatever. And now I'm like, what's awesome? Growing up on a farm. So there's, all those kind of connection points are so interesting that when you don't share your story, you can't have those connection points and then you can't change your own narrative about it.
When we look back at this historical account, and the way that we move from different places and parts. Like I think of Yellowstone and, all of the different episodes of the different, segments, the franchise or whatever from, the evolution of this family going to Montana. But it was the stories of each of the characters that made the journey amazing. And if we think back, if we're restricting where we're at today and we want to either revise history or not revisit it, then we're not either coming full circle to the lessons of old or we're not drawing people in to what we're trying to accomplish. If we think now organizationally, I'm as a leader, I'm leading an organization, is I need to be able to tell a story to bring people in so they can choose to believe in it. If not, that's okay. There's somewhere else for you to go to believe in. But if you hear, I want you to believe so you can see what I see, because that's the only way for us to go forward.
Yes. And I think Yellowstone's a great example. What you pinpointed there is like, Yellowstone would not have been a good show if the show was, here's how our family has an amazing farm or an amazing land, and we're doing really well. And look at how great we're doing and everyone's happily married. And we have this amazing life and we're really good at riding horses and isn't nature beautiful? That's called a, Planet Earth documentary. That's not Yellowstone, right? The reason we like Yellowstone actually is because of addiction. It's because of pain. It's because of violence. It's because of relationships falling apart. It's because it tells the truth, right? That's why we like
Relatability.
Yes, there's a relatability, there's access, there's vulnerability. We like shows like that because we always see a tiny bit of ourselves in the good and in the bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we see that story is reflected back to us. So in our own leadership too, what we don't want to do is tell a story like, we have built this thing and it's gone well the whole time. And now guess what? It's still going well. Thank you for coming. And people are like, okay. But telling how we overcame something, what we've been through, what we're discovering, what we're learning, to kind of tell the whole truth is so important. One of the things that we'll talk about at your event that I get to share is that the root word of restore is to restory something. And the root word of destroy is to de-story something. So actually, when we experience restoration, it's because we are given a new narrative. That's why we feel restored, right? That's how we feel about what God does for us, right? We're like, the story that I believe about God is actually now mine. I'm restored, right? But we experience de-storying when we're like, this isn't making sense. I'm not aligning with this. I don't like who I am anymore. They're mean. We play the victim, or there's all those pieces to the de-storying. But I think what you're saying is that we get to actually tell the whole truth about our story and then experience restoration in it.
So let's play a little game.
Okay.
Okay. It's a play game of pick the one that doesn't fit.
Okay.
All right. Can you do that?
I hope so.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Stories sell. Stories connect. Stories bore. Stories inspire.
Bore. Bore is incorrect.
Okay. But here's what happens is I think we go back to that conversation about people telling stories. They think, I don't want to tell my story because it'll bore them.
Yeah.
And what happens is then you don't give opportunity for the others.
Right. And what's the alternative? That's what I would say back. If, okay, your story is going to bore someone, what's the alternative? You're not known. Like the alternative is you never connect with anyone, right? No, then figure out how to make your story less boring. It isn't boring.
So how do you do that?
Yeah. So we'll do that at your event, and I have like a whole workshop and I have a course on like really how to get into the nitty gritty of it. But baseline, every single story is made up of 3 C's. And those 3 C's are context, conflict, and conclusion. And all of our stories have to have all 3 of those things in order to be an effective story. No matter how short and no matter how long, every good story has context, the who, what, where, why, conflict, what almost went wrong, what didn't go wrong, what were you worried about, what happened, what went awry, what were you scared of, and then conclusion. Because of this, I learned. Now I know. Now we see. Now you can. Now I know. So every good story has those building blocks. And when you take all the fluff away and you just go, here's 1 sentence of context, here's 2 sentences of conflict, and here's 3 of conclusion, you can build a pretty great story.
So Kelly, my wife, always complains about I tell stories. I give context, I give conflict. And then she said, you suck at the conclusion. Because they just kind of like, And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, here's the thing is like, and you tell me, you're the storytelling expert. You're the one that's helping us communicate better is, if you're going to err on a side of having less information, is it less with the context, less with the conflict, less with the conclusion? Like, how do you navigate that so there's enough so it tastes just right?
It's hyper individualized, unfortunately, but all of us have 1 weak C.
Okay. So mine obviously is the conclusion. Okay. As evidenced by my wife telling me your stories suck because you just all of a sudden you get us all there and then it just boom.
Yes. And I'll give you an example. One of my dear friends, he is very bad at context. And sometimes he tells stories like this. Yeah, there was a horse. And I'm like, where? He's like, outside. I'm like, where were you? He's like, in the car. I'm like, who was with you? It's like, my kids. I'm like, what was happening? He's like, the horse came in the street. I'm like, is everyone okay? He's like, yeah, it was crazy. And I'm like, okay, too many follow-up questions, right? Too many follow-up questions. If someone
Dude, that sounds like a comedy skit. Like that really sounds like a skit.
But we all know someone who says something and you have to ask 400 questions to get the correct data, right? But then we also have people like my dear friend who they both know that I share this and they're hilarious. But she really does socially tell stories like, okay, it was May of 2022, mid-May, and we were walking down the street, and do you remember that street? It was Lemon. I think you had that yellow sweater. Do you remember that sweater? And we were by the sushi restaurant where you had your 29th birthday, right? And then we were walking down, and I'm like, where are we headed? Do you know what I mean? Like, she'll paint the picture for 70% of the story. And then I'm like, let's go. What's going on here? So she gives all these details, like where we are, who we are, what I'm wearing, what she's wearing, the exact date and time, and I'm like, okay, where are we headed here? And I need her to get to the conflict so that I can get compelled to join the story. So some of us just give too much of each one of those things, and too little. So I think first identifying which C you're worst at, which you already did, congratulations, or figuring out kind of what place we need more or less is a great part of kind of figuring out our storytelling. And yeah, I love that I get to give people really practical confidence. Like, I know this sounds very hard, but I'm not asking you to write a novel, right? It's just about putting 1 sentence in each piece of the story, and then you can build something really compelling.
So people that you've worked with, obviously you shared 2 friends there. One gives no context. The other one gives so much context. And you're just like, let's get to the point. Come on, let's go. When we think about why people in positions don't share stories, is it as simple as they just don't know how to construct it? They don't know how to put it together. So they're trying to come up with the memory, to come up with the ideas. And now with this framework, it's like, all right, give context, give conflict, make sure the conclusion. Okay. Yeah. Make sure there's a good, compelling conclusion. This is what happened then. This was the result. This is what I then did. I'm learning because you've shared a lot of your content. I can't wait to learn more so I can get better at concluding stories and not rambling on with all sorts of context and conflict. What I want to know is, again, where we stumble, so we can see that rock, that pebble on the ground. Because if we know stories are as old as people, we know stories actually move people to making decisions. Like there's no other decisions but stories. How do we make sure that we grab a hold of that and say, you know what? I'm going to walk away from here after listening to Tyler and Katie, and I'm going to make sure that I start telling my story.
Yeah. Step one is to pay attention. Storytelling is just something that we, do without paying attention all of our life. And then one day we wake up and we're like, oh, wait, other people are better storytellers. I wonder why. So I think step one is paying attention. The greatest storytellers are interested before they are interesting. So the first step actually in growing in your storytelling is just becoming wildly interested in the stories of others. Pay attention to them, listen to them, hear them out, find good stories. And that's going to be such an incredible mirror for you to say, oh, wow, they act really excited when they tell a story. Oh, they are good at wrapping it up. Oh, they are not too long-winded. Oh, they actually look excited when they're telling it. And that makes me feel excited. These tiny pieces to the puzzle that really will grow in your storytelling skills is first just paying attention, because it just feels like something kind of nebulous, but really it is a practical skill.
So who are some of the people that you're just like, man, I love to sit at their feet and just listen to their stories?
I mean, my family is good storytellers. Like my cousins, my dad is a great storyteller. That's who makes me the happiest. I mean, I really do believe that the greatest stories are told at dinner tables. So it's not stages, it's not podcasts, it's not, that's great. That's great storytelling. But true influential storytelling takes place when we share a table with people. And so I think that's where people really make a difference in their stories, is sharing it in those environments. But yeah, I mean, I could laugh. I have very fun and funny friends, who tell stories that I literally smile just thinking about them. Or, people who just tell amazing stories in my life. So that to me is the most inspiring storytellers are the people I get to share meals with.
Okay, so that's your family. Who is someone's listening? It's like, all right, Katie, like you think they're a great storyteller. Who can I go listen to, watch, so I can, pick up some of these nuances?
A great place to start is The Moth. The Moth is a storytelling world. It's an organization that's across the globe. But you can listen to the Moth podcast. You can go to a Moth live event, and they are all 5-minute true personal stories told around a theme.
Okay.
And this
is like a competition. I've heard of these competitions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like storytelling competitions.
Yes. I think everyone in the world should do it. It is so fun.
Have you done it?
I have done it. Yes.
Okay. How'd you do?
I won. Yeah.
What?
It went well. Yeah. It went well.
So you actually have some like credence to this ability to tell people how to tell stories.
Yeah. Thankfully, yes. I do have a paper printed certificate. And then I did get to compete in the Grand Slam, which was, so you win Story Slam, you compete in Grand Slam, you get, I mean, it's like a very fun whole process. Yeah, but listening to a 5-minute story is very helpful, because like watching a movie isn't necessarily going to make you a better storyteller, right? You're like, okay, screenwriters, I'm not, I can't write a script. I can't, I have no concept. Yeah. But a 5-minute true live story from diverse voices, like you can go to the Moth podcast right now and listen to 50 random people tell a true life story around a theme. So I think that's a great place to start, because you're like, oh wow, that's great to know. And there's totally a science to it. There's some great books called How to Tell a Story, Storytelling Basics. I mean, there's some awesome resources too. So I think that's probably where I tell them to start.
What's the story you're waiting to tell? What's a story that's like right there? You're like, oh, I need to tell this story. But it's like it's moved from wound to it's got a scar. It's got a fresh scar, kind of like the scar on top of my head from my sunburn. What's that story that Katie's got to tell?
One of the stories I don't think we tell enough. I think we tell a lot of romantic love stories, but I don't think we tell enough friendship stories.
Okay.
And I had a really a significant friend breakup, and then we became friends again, and it's been so healing. And she's so important to me. And we went through such a journey and through a million giant reasons and a lot of therapy. And that I'm realizing more and more people when I go to spaces say like, oh, this friend was really important to me, or I broke up with this friend or this. And I'm like, oh, friend relationship narratives. We talk all about like meet, date, break up, like romantic, all that kind of stuff. But I do think there's some untold narratives there that need to come out to help all of us normalize the lifelong friendship journey. That I think is pretty interesting.
I think one of the things I shared one of the impactful stories that happened in my life, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
I can tell it's still fresh.
Yeah.
It's just healing over. It's
Yeah.
great. The ability for you to share that story helps someone else to either process, go through their own experiences so it can be then a story they can share. I believe that. I believe that for me, I believe that is one of the great, I think I mentioned to you, my brother's life has purpose.
Right.
Because of what happened in me being able to tell the story.
Yes.
That would not have happened without it.
Yes.
But it takes so much effort to get there.
Yeah.
It takes time to get there. But I think we're spurred along by us telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Your camera went out though. Is that okay?
I know. I did.
Okay.
I was just going to keep on babbling on.
Yeah.
No,
it does.
Hold on. So, dude, it's freaking hot. All right. I even opened a window earlier. See, this is more reason for me, Katie, as you get to meet my wife, say, I need to be in a different office because the camera keeps shutting down because it's so hot in here. She turns on her heater, so it's a freaking sauna. Like, she leaves it on all day. We just got a sauna. She's sitting in there and she's just like, this is amazing. Going to her office, like, no, it's the same temperature. She's like, well, I'm just cold. Like, how can you operate? One day I got like one of those digital thermometers and I come into my office and I'm just like, I am sweating. It's way hotter than what it is now. And like the top half of my office is 85 degrees. I'm like, this is so flipping hot. The bottom half is like 76, 75. Yeah. It's pretty comfortable. Yeah. And I open up the door and it's like this Arctic blast coming in. I'm like, oh my goodness. I go to her office, which is on the other side of our house, and it's like 72. And I'm like, what, how does it come over here? And she's like, this feels amazing. And I'm like, I am drenched in sweat. It's why I wear black. Yes. The conclusion why I wear black is so that way I don't show my pit stains. Yes. How did I do concluding that story, Katie?
Fantastic. Exactly. Sounds like you got it.
That's why I wear black.
And that's why I wear black. Yes. Perfect.
Man, I am, as we're trying to gather back here, as cameras are overheating, it's that hot of a story. It's that hot of a conversation we're having. We've made both cameras shut down.
It's white hot. That's it.
White hot. So we talked about the 3 C's. Context, conflict, conclusion. I'm working on conclusion, right? We're trying to get better there. How do you best, as we're thinking about the 5-minute stories, right, from the author, you're competing, like, how do we make sure that we have enough? I think back in high school, we had this teacher, this was back in the 90s. So of course it's inappropriate. I'm going to share it. We might have it explicit. I don't know. And he said, it's kind of like a mini skirt. It is long enough to cover the subject, short enough to stay interesting. I don't know a better way to say it. That's the story. How do you tell stories and make sure that has all the information so it covers everything, but yet it's still interesting?
The mini skirt model is, I'm just kidding. The way that I think a lot of that, I think that dance is entirely dependent upon audience and time. So
which skirt is appropriate?
Mm-hmm. And the answer is the muumuu. I think that there is a reality there for like how it truly is audience and time dependent. Sometimes at a dinner table, everyone is so relaxed and happy and has had a glass of wine and you're like, I can go into detail and make this story so fun, and people are like with you. Sometimes you're at a networking event and you're at a random table and you have 4 seconds to connect with someone and you have to say something like, I was raised on a farm, went through a lot of stuff, launched a company, built a brand, and now we have an amazing network of people who want to be better leaders. And you're like, oh, that was that's all you got. So I think that it really is dependent upon audience and experience, and paying attention to that does take a lot of emotional intelligence. But there is a great work of just starting at 1 minute. When you can start at a minute with
Okay.
your story, like, hey, I want to try to memorize a story that's a minute long, you can usually expand that to 5 minutes and shorten that to 30 seconds. But it's really tough to write a 30-minute story and be like, how do I say that in a minute? So it's a little bit of a
Yeah.
dance.
So, I mean, help us a little bit, just a little bit deeper there. Like, you talk about reading the person, reading the room, understanding the situation. Like, what cues are you? I'm thinking about, all right, where someone's coming to the event or someone's listening right now, and they're going to give a market presentation to their board of directors, right? A very reasonable situation, and there are stories there. Like, how do they craft that story to make sure, one, it's relevant and people are like, oh, I want to hear more about what you're dealing with?
The first question to ask is, what does your audience value? So that is the first question we're asking here. The first question is not, what stories do I have and what am I trying to say? The first question is, what is your audience value? So a board of directors is a great example. So I know the board of directors cares about the bottom line, it cares about new hires, and it cares about innovation. So because I know those three things are the highest values, I am going to shape and find my narratives and research around that, whether or not that was asked of me. So, I mean, we've joked about this, but I don't know if you know this, but politicians, they don't even answer the questions that are asked of them. So all they do is they tell the story they want to tell. Like, so if you're like, hey, what is your policy on whatever? They say, you know what that reminds me of? When I was 7. And you're like, wait, what?
Wait. There's a great element here because you just, I mean, you led us into something I don't think if you realize or not is that they tell the story they want to
Right.
tell. And how much do we trust those people?
Right.
Is there a connection there?
I mean, I think that what we can learn from them is persuasion. So I think that that's kind of the persuasion, that their narrative persuasion is very effective. But their
Okay.
human connectedness is zero. So I think that we have to find a balance there. But I think kind of figuring out back to your original question, I think figuring out what people value and writing from there is really effective.
Persuasion and connectedness. I heard from a mentor that the difference between persuasion and manipulation is who it benefits.
Good. Yeah.
That was John
Yeah.
Maxwell. He's
Yeah.
pretty good. Yeah, he's pretty smart. He'll be at the event
Yes.
as well. But the persuasion and connection and coming back to that, like if we are willing to connect with people, then we'll do whatever. I believe connection is putting your arm around someone. That's how I describe empathy, is putting your arm around someone, walking with them. And I think that's an excellent visual for me to think about. How do you connect with someone? Well, you have to get personal with them enough that they're willing to allow you to put their arm around you. You have to be vulnerable yourself for allow them for vulnerability. And I think about, as we're telling stories, how much are stories a tool for empathetic connection?
Yeah. In every way. Yes. I mean, I think that's how once someone says, hey, this thing's been really hard, you get to validate and say, it sounds like it has. And in some ways, me too.
Again, I think of the work you do and the excitement of this idea of storytelling and why it's in such a world. I have a storytelling books. I see it as a necessity in our world today more than ever. You obviously do. You did several years ago, and you work with organizations that are sensing more and more and more, oh, we need stories. And is it because we have lost our way, or because we're yearning to find that, okay, from a psychological standpoint, I need to know why, because that's what's going to drive me?
I think organizationally, it's because organizations have marketing teams, and marketing teams are telling good stories, and the rest of the organization is like, wait, that's working. And then they're like, wait, should we be telling good stories among our teams? And should we be telling good stories to our staff? And should we be telling good stories to the people we lead? And so I think that organizationally has been a really big trend, is that they're like, this one team knows how to tell good stories, but then you go to this other team who's doing just as good of work. But because they don't know how to talk about it, we don't know it. So a part of it is just elevating the skill set of those teams, So I think organizationally it's that, but interpersonally, I think it's that, like the ultimate cure for an AI world is like human storytelling, like the thing that AI doesn't know is what happened to you in 4th grade. Like the thing that AI doesn't know is what we have in common. in our hearts. Like those human connected abilities are what give like flavor and life and yeah, cure loneliness and these big things that we're fighting.
That are everywhere in society. They're not only wherever we look outside, but they're also internal in organizations. And if we work on that internally, it's kind of like you bring up marketing. It's like everything marketing is external, but then turning around and say, no, 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 we need to work internally marketing. I read a book, Jeff Henderson wrote, Know What You're Made For. He's a great storyteller. He's a great marketer. He was a marketer at Chick-fil-A. And out of that book and my conversation with Jeff was that great marketing is great leadership and great leadership is great marketing. And I think the bond that is coming at this moment is because they all center around stories. And it's either my story and like you come into my story, let's make a story together, or how do our stories compare so that way we can move down that path of persuasion and influence. But that's done by telling stories, sharing stories, or creating a story.
Absolutely. And great leaders restory their teams. Great leaders, when someone on their team feels like I'm not good enough, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, great leaders say, this is who you are, this is what we're doing, and this is why it matters. And they actually restory their teams, and then they get to say to them, this is why your work matters. Do you remember when this thing happened? Do you remember how you did that? And you get to reflect those stories back to them. That's the restorative nature of really great leadership.
As you say that, I think of Donald Miller in his books, Story Brand or Hero on a Mission. And it's kind of, you're taking that opportunity as the leader to be the guide, to make them the hero, choose to get past the victim and villain. If you've read those books, hopefully you guys have, if you're listening, that it has that context, but it is so much more. And I think that's where it's like using that story and creating the new story, the restoring, because that's our great opportunity to connect. As you enter into this next phase, as we think about the event coming up, what are you most excited about impacting people through stories?
I mean, I can't wait to hear your story if you're going to be at the event. I want to know what it is and what you've been through and I want that there to be space for you to really process that and see value in your story. I'm so excited for my session just to give you like really practical tips for this. Like, here is how to gain confidence, condense it, make it compelling, create concise narratives. So that'll be really fun at the session itself. But the gift for me is that at events like this, people realize, oh, wait, I'm not just one story. I'm a lot of things. Like, I'm allowed to be a bunch of stories. I'm not just that one thing that happened to me that one time. I am a continually evolving narrative. And all those stories matter too. And so it's kind of just like the broadening of perspective, the creating of clarity, and then really what channel now does that story need to be told on? Let's figure it out. Let's tell it.
One final question, Katie, and this is kind of maybe it's going to be a deeper one, is one thing that I've had is oftentimes I don't think of my stories. I shared with you about my brother, and for many years, I just didn't think, or, growing up on a farm, I just didn't think that it would matter. Like, I remember reading a book, Adam Grant's latest book, Hidden Potential, and there's a individual who became an astronaut, and his name is Jose Hernandez, and he grew up as a migrant farm worker, and they asked him, why did you never tell that story? And he goes, well, I didn't think it was relevant. How do you encourage me? How do you encourage those listening to say, hey, your stories do matter, but you got to mine them? How do we mine them? How do we come up with them and find situations to share the stories? Because a lot of them, I'm going about my day. I didn't even realize there was a story there.
I mean, I have a course called Story School, and you can really sit in that course and find your 7 key moments from your life and then ascribe value to them and then figure out what those values are and then live into them. So I have an actual framework for this for people who are like, Katie, literally tell me how. So that is in my course called Story School, which I can send to Tyler and connect to you all. But I think for a lot of people, we think that people only want to know the end of the story. Like astronaut, Tyler, like impact-driven leader, like we think that people only want to know the shiny parts, but the origin, the overcoming, the obstacles, that gives the end result authority. Right? So that gives the thing that you earned weight. And so I think that that's just a good reminder for all of us. Like, people do want to know those things. Yeah, they might not want to know like what happened every year of your life for the last 30 years, but they do want to know, hey, how come you are the way you are? And that's helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. Remember to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. By rating and reviewing each episode, you can help more people discover impactful leaders like Katie. Remember, she will be speaking at the Impact Summit event, July 29th and 30th. If it's already past that date, sorry you missed it. There will be recording available. Go check it out at tylerdickerhoof.com. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.
Thanks, Tyler.